When I wrote a book about addiction, I was absolutely terrified that my mother would go off the deep end with fury and hurt that I exposed our secret. Instead, her reaction absolutely stunned me, and it changed my perspective on everything. In 2012, my novel Easter Ann Peters' Operation Cool was published. It's a coming-of-age story that addresses parental alcoholism. Now, publishing a book is like birthing something into the world, and it's terrifying because what if everybody hates it? What if you get terrible reviews? But for me, I really only had one fear: my mother's reaction to it. The book was obviously inspired by my personal experiences growing up with a parent who has a substance use disorder. And for the very first time, I would be talking openly about that, which is a drastic flip from the secrecy that we wrapped around it my entire life. But see, at that point, when I was about 26 years old, I was so depressed and felt hopeless about the future. I was at my rock bottom, and that book changed my life. At that point, I was feeling like I didn't even want to go on anymore. My mother was at the worst point in her battle with alcoholism that she had been at that point in our lives. And my sister was a tween, and she was really struggling with it. It was causing her a lot of harm, in addition to my father and me. And while I was beginning my education about being an adult child of an alcoholic and beginning my healing journey, I read every book I could find about addiction and codependency and ACoA stuff, and I wanted my little sister to have that kind of education and that realization that we had nothing to do with mom's addiction and that we needed to take good care of ourselves. But I found next to zero books that addressed addiction or alcoholism or anything like that for kids of that age. I thought, how is this possible? It's the 21st century. We're talking about all these different types of topics. How could this still be such a secret? How could millions of kids be thinking that they're the only ones going through this? So in that creative writing class, I found a lot of joy in writing, just as I did as a girl. I was turning in like 2 homework assignments at once just for the fun of it. And out quickly came this story about a 12-year-old girl who wanted to have an awesome 7th grade year, to make new friends, to reinvent herself. But those plans are derailed as she copes with her mother's growing drinking problem in their little Michigan town. I definitely didn't intend to write a children's story, but it just came flying out of me as if a girl named Easter Ann was whispering the story into my ear. And so I had several chapters written, and my instructor wanted me to read a few to the class, and I was really embarrassed because I thought, all right, everyone's like 17 and 18 years old. I'm the 26-year-old woman dressed in business attire who arrives to class early and is just like here for fun. It seems like I would have something more sophisticated than a children's story. And I remember there was a kid sitting across the room who only sometimes came to class. He was kind of like gothic and always dressed in black and seemed really cynical about the class and everything in it. And I thought, oh, this is a story written for 12-year-olds, and it's written from the voice of a 12-year-old. This kind of thing is going to be grating to him and others in the class. But I read it, and as I finished the last few sentences and I looked up, I made eye contact with him, and he sat up and said, I really related to that story, and you captured all of the feelings. You really have to keep going with that story. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I knew he was an ACoA, an adult child of an alcoholic, just like me. And at first glance, 10 years apart, looking very different, from different backgrounds, it looked like we had nothing in common, yet we knew in that moment that we had shared the same story. And I thought about all the kids maybe who could benefit from this story and how I would have benefited when I was a girl, and so I thought I really have to keep going with this. Before long, I had a whole book manuscript, and I'd mentioned it to my mother in passing that I was really enjoying writing and that I thought I had a book and it could possibly be shared with the world as a real book and help kids. And I remember she was really negative about it. She was sober at the time too. And she said, that's a waste of time because it's virtually impossible to get a book published. And so immediately like rejected my dream, I just never talked about it again. And I spent the next 2 years joining writers groups and meeting the most inspiring and encouraging people who shared similar interests as me. I went to writers workshops and conferences, and I really just immersed myself in making that story stronger and improving it. And I was really determined to get it into the hands of kids. And I went to a conference, and I was so excited because I learned that the book was selected to be read by one of the editors at a major children's book publishing company. And I thought, this is it. This is it. It's going to make its way. It's going to be in the bookstores, and people might really benefit from it. And I sat down with the editor, and she said, there's great character development. It's a strong story. However, you really need to downplay the piece about the moms drinking and just highlight the bullying and friendship elements. And I said, well, you missed the whole point of the story. That's why I want to share the story. It's that addiction piece. It's so common. I explained, 1 in 5 kids in the US is living with a parent who's abusing alcohol, and that's probably even higher than that. And she said, well, I understand. However, this is much too sensitive of a topic. You won't sell it. And so I went back to my hotel room and cried into my pillow because I thought, how can it be that these gatekeepers are knowingly keeping it a secret in families and preventing societal change to help kids realize that they're not alone and to help them along? And so I kept pushing, and I got dozens and dozens of rejection letters and other suggestions to remove that addiction piece. And finally, a publisher in Michigan took a chance on me and believed in Easter Ann's story, and it was published in 2012. So thrilled that it was actually going to be a real live book and that it would help people in the way that I wished I had been helped as a kid. So I was really excited, but then I had this blow of realization that I was about to expose my family's secret, because surely it would be quite obvious and I would be openly talking about the fact that the story was inspired by my own experience growing up with a mother who battled a substance use disorder. And I thought, what is my mother's reaction going to be about it? What if she goes totally nuts? What if she is so angry that she cuts me out of her life, that she just plummets worse into addiction, that everything because of me is worse for my father and for my sister and for everyone? What if she's so hurt that it spirals into these binges that could kill her or cause her to drink and drive and kill other people? All because I wanted to share the story, and I thought, why couldn't I just keep it to myself as a journal writing thing, as an expression of my own healing? Why did I feel the need to share it with everyone else? And I was really angry with myself. I felt like I was being selfish. So I told my father that I was terrified about Mom's reaction and any fallout that would come from this. And he was really supportive. I think on some level he recognized that I was trying to do something that would have really benefited me as a kid. He just didn't know how to do it himself because he didn't have the education or tools to do so. And so he was really supportive. He even reached out to his friends and acquaintances on email and social media, and he was so proud and excited about it. And I think he might have even talked to my mother about how he thought it was so good that I was doing that. But regardless of my father's support, nothing compared to what was riding on my mother's reaction to it. The first copy from the publisher, I gave it to my dad, and he was so excited to read it, but I gave him very clear instructions that my mother was not to see it because I wanted to have a formal conversation with her face to face and tell her why I felt so compelled and strong about sharing our story and how it would help people and what I discovered about very little out there for kids. I wanted to just convince her and get her support if I could. I was waiting for this perfect condition. But one day I got a call from my dad when I was at work, and he said, "Mom's not good today." And I hated those calls because I knew that it just made me so anxious. But I needed to know that because at that time, my dad and I were kind of balancing the parental role, since Mom was not being a mother to my sister, and my sister was really being negatively affected by it. So I needed to know that when my dad left for work, mid-afternoon, because he worked at night, that I would probably need to hurry home from work to be there for my sister and get her out of the house, or just make sure that everything was okay. So I had that, and then my dad said, "And she read your book." And I had to get off because I was at work, and I just felt waves of nausea coming over me. Like, what am I going to walk into when I come home? This is it. She is going to go crazy. Driving home and thinking about how I would address my mom's probably volcanic reaction to this, and the phone rang, and it was the house, the caller ID was the house line, and I thought it was my sister, so I said, "Hi, Brooke," and instead it was my mom, and she said, "Jody, your book," and she was sobbing and sobbing, and I don't know if I pulled over because I should have. I was so nervous. I just felt sick. And I said, "What?" And she said, "I read your book." And she was crying and crying and crying. And I was bracing myself for like F-bombs and being told that I was selfish and how could I do this to her, and that she was angry. And she said, your book is going to help kids." And she was crying and crying. "Thank you," I think I whispered. And she said, "But," and I thought, here it comes, here it comes. Now she's gonna unleash it on me. But instead she said, "That's how I felt. That's how I felt as a little girl with my dad." Oh my God. See, my mother's father died of a brain aneurysm when my mother was only 11 years old, and it was likely induced by his extreme alcoholism. And my mother rarely ever talked about her father, and when she did, it was happy memories, like how he would create a skating rink in their backyard every winter for my mother and her 7 siblings. I knew it was bad with his alcoholism and obviously the death, but just because she never talked about it, I never thought about her experiences growing up with an alcoholic parent as well. I was talking to a fellow adult child of an alcoholic, and that my mother and I had experienced the same kind of feelings. But sadly, my mother didn't get educated or take the steps for healing before she was gripped in addiction herself. And she talked about some memories that I'd never heard before, about how my mother would be walking to school and she would see my drunken grandfather walking down the street, like stumbling home from the pub, still drunk from the night before, and how she would be so mortified that she would have to cross the street and pray that none of the other kids recognized that that was her father. It is hard to hear the stories from other kids who've gone through trauma, who've grown up in dysfunctional environments, but it was extremely hard to hear it coming directly from my mother. Now, she was drunk, so I kept reminding myself that her reaction when sober might be entirely different, that she might be fueled by the emotional memories of her father. But in that moment, I just appreciated getting a glimpse into my mother's world and the trauma that she experienced. And not once did she mention anything about the story reflecting my experience or any shame or anger that she had. And in that moment, I understood my mother better than I ever had in my entire life. After that, we really didn't talk about it. She didn't attend my book events. She didn't discuss the media coverage that resulted when the book was launched. And since then, she knows that I still write and talk about this, but she just doesn't talk about it. I think she recognizes that the good in helping others outweighs the shame and anger that she might feel having our secret shared. And for that, I am extremely grateful. But I know that even if she suddenly took issue with it, that this is my adult child of an alcoholic journey. This is my story of being a 35-year-old woman in the year 2018, building the life that I want and deserve. This is my story to share, and I feel really called to share this. More is needed. After the book was launched in 2012, I had the great opportunity to take some days off from work and for free speak at schools here in Michigan. And I discovered that so many teachers were excited to have a free speaker talking about writing and reading and bullying and friendship and other topics addressed in the book, but they didn't want me to talk about addiction or alcoholism. And I specifically remember one fourth grade teacher talking to me about this, and she said, if you could just avoid that topic altogether, hopefully some kids, read your book and they could, learn about it that way, but I don't want you to talk about it. And I said, well, you do realize that more than a quarter of your students are probably living with addiction today, and they could really benefit from learning that they're not alone and it's not their fault and all of that. And she said, oh yes, of course, but it's a very sensitive and controversial topic, and I don't want to get those parent phone calls. Some parents might not want their kids to learn about addiction. Then I said, yes, because they're probably battling addiction themselves, and they don't want that secret exposed. But I have heard from hundreds of people of all ages and backgrounds from around the world who have appreciated the story and appreciated that I'm talking about this. But writing that story was all worth it, even before the book was available for order, because I received a call from the Betty Ford Center that had received a copy of the book in advance, and they'd given it to a 12-year-old girl whose mother was in treatment there, and she said it was her favorite book ever, and that she had learned for the first time that she had nothing to do with her mother's addiction. I hope you are so well in your journey today and that you are actively building the life that you want and deserve.